My name is Jennifer Wood, and I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. 78 years on this earth have taught me that the cruelest betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people who call you Mom, and then treat you like yesterday's newspaper when you're no longer convenient. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months ago, I thought I was going to spend a pleasant afternoon touring Meadowbrook assisted living with my son David. He'd been so concerned about me living alone after my fall last winter. "Just to see what's available, Mom," he said, his voice soft with what I believed was genuine care. "Just in case we ever need options down the road." I should have known better. I should have seen the signs. But when you love someone the way a mother loves her child, you tend to see only what you want to see. You make excuses for behavior that would send red flags shooting up if it came from anyone else. Today, as I sit in room 247 of Meadowbrook Assisted Living, looking at the 4 walls that have become my prison, I'm going to tell you exactly how my own son manipulated me into this place and then abandoned me here like unwanted furniture. But more importantly, I'm going to tell you what I did about it. Because you see, David made one crucial mistake. He assumed that because I'm old, I'm powerless. He assumed that because I trusted him, I was stupid. And he definitely assumed that his inheritance was guaranteed, no matter how he treated me. He was wrong on all counts. The morning started like any other Tuesday in September. I remember because I had my weekly hair appointment scheduled for 2 o'clock, and I was particularly excited about trying a new shade that Martha at the salon had recommended. At 78, I still believe in looking my best. My late husband. Robert used to say that confidence was the most beautiful thing a woman could wear, and even though he's been gone for 12 years now, I've never forgotten that. I was in my garden, deadheading the last of the summer roses, when David's car pulled into my driveway. He didn't usually visit on weekdays. His insurance business kept him busy, and his wife Sharon was always scheduling something for the evenings. But there he was, stepping out of his black BMW with that practiced smile he wore when he wanted something. "Good morning, beautiful," he called out, using the pet name he'd had for me since childhood. It still made my heart flutter a little, I'll admit. Despite everything that's happened, despite what I know now, there's still a part of me that remembers the sweet little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms and tell me I was the bravest person in the world. I straightened up from the rose bush, brushing the dirt from my gardening gloves. "David, honey, what a lovely surprise. I wasn't expecting you today." He walked over and kissed my cheek, and I caught a whiff of his expensive cologne. Everything about David was expensive these days. His clothes, his car, his house in the suburbs with the perfectly manicured lawn and the swimming pool that Sharon insisted they needed, even though neither of them swam much. I'd helped with the down payment on that house, actually. $30,000 from my savings account because David said they were just a little short, and it was such a great investment opportunity. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, which should have been my first clue that something was off. David's office was across town, and he had no other business in my area, but I was so pleased to see him that I pushed the thought aside. "Actually, Mom, I wanted to talk to you about something. Do you have a few minutes?" I gestured toward the house. "Of course, sweetheart. Come on in. I'll make us some coffee." My house was exactly the way Robert and I had left it when we'd finished redecorating 15 years ago. The living room still had the blue and cream color scheme we'd chosen together, with the antique mahogany furniture that had belonged to my mother. The walls were covered with family photos, David's school pictures, his wedding photos. Pictures of Robert and me from our 43 years of marriage. It was a home filled with memories, with love, with the kind of warmth that can only come from decades of shared life. David settled into Robert's old recliner while I puttered around the kitchen, preparing our coffee the way he liked it. 2 sugars, a splash of cream. Through the pass-through window, I could see him looking around the living room with an expression I couldn't quite read. He seemed to be cataloging things, his eyes moving from the antique china cabinet to the Persian rug to the oil painting of the lake house where we'd spent so many summers when he was growing up. "Here we are," I said, carrying in the coffee tray that had been a wedding gift from Robert's mother. I'd used it for every special occasion for over 50 years, and using it now felt like I was marking this as an important moment with my son. David took his cup and leaned forward in the chair. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about you lately, about how you're managing here all by yourself." I felt a little stab of defensiveness. "I'm managing just fine, thank you very much. I've been living in this house for 38 years, David. I know every creaky floorboard and every stubborn door handle. This is my home." I know," he said quickly, holding up a hand. "And I'm not saying you're not capable. You're the most capable woman I know. But Mom, you're 78 years old. That fall you had last winter scared me to death. What if something happened and nobody was around to help you?" The fall. I should have known he'd bring that up. It had been a stupid accident. I'd been carrying laundry upstairs and missed the top step, tumbling backward and bruising my hip badly enough to keep me laid up for a week. David had been wonderfully attentive during my recovery, calling every day, bringing groceries, even hiring a cleaning lady to help out. At the time, I'd been so grateful for his concern. Now I wonder if he was already planning what came next. "That was months ago," I said. "And I've been perfectly fine since then. I had those grab bars installed in the bathroom just like you suggested, and I'm much more careful on the stairs now." "But what about next time?" David pressed. "Mom, I love you too much to just sit back and wait for something terrible to happen. I want to know that you're safe, that you're taken care of." There was something in his tone that made me look at him more carefully. He was using what Robert and I used to call his sales voice, the smooth, persuasive tone he'd perfected in his insurance business. It was the voice he used when he was trying to convince clients to buy policies they weren't sure they needed. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked. David set down his coffee cup and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a glossy brochure. "I've been doing some research, and I found this place. Meadowbrook Assisted Living. It's supposed to be one of the nicest facilities in the area. I was thinking maybe we could just go take a look at it, just to see what's available. You know?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Just in case we ever need options down the road. I took the brochure from him and flipped through it. The photos showed cheerful rooms with big windows, smiling elderly residents engaged in various activities, staff members who looked like they genuinely cared. It did look nice, I had to admit. But the idea of leaving my home, of giving up my independence, made my stomach clench with anxiety. "I don't know, David," I said slowly. "I really don't think I'm ready for something like this." "I'm not saying you need to move in tomorrow," he said quickly. "I'm just saying, let's go look. What's the harm in looking? And if you hate it, we'll never mention it again. But if you like it, well, at least we'll know it's there if we ever need it." I studied my son's face. He looked genuinely concerned, genuinely loving. His eyes, the same green eyes he'd inherited from Robert, were soft with what appeared to be worry for my well-being. How could I refuse such a reasonable request? How could I deny my only child the peace of mind that would come from knowing I had options? "All right," I said finally. "We can go look. But just look. Understand? I'm not making any commitments." David's face lit up with a smile that reminded me so much of the little boy he'd been. "Of course, Mom. Just to look. I'll call them right now and set up a tour." He was already pulling out his phone, and I realized he must have researched the place thoroughly to have their number so readily available. He spoke to someone on the other end with the easy confidence of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. "Great news," he said after hanging up. "They can fit us in this afternoon. The director herself is going to give us the tour." "This afternoon?" I felt a flutter of panic. "But David, I have my hair appointment at 2. I can't just cancel at the last minute." "Mom, this is more important than your hair," he said, and there was just a hint of impatience in his voice that he quickly covered with another smile. "Besides, you look beautiful just as you are. We'll reschedule the hair appointment for another day." I should have insisted on keeping my appointment. I should have told him that my commitments mattered too, that my routine was important to me. But David was already putting the brochure back in his pocket and standing up, clearly expecting me to go along with his plan. "I suppose I should change clothes," I said, looking down at my gardening outfit. Comfortable slacks and an old blouse that had seen better days. "You look fine," David said. "It's just a quick look around. Nothing formal." So I found myself in the passenger seat of David's BMW, driving through the tree-lined streets of our town toward Meadowbrook Assisted Living. The facility was located in what had once been a beautiful residential area, and the building itself was designed to blend in with the surrounding neighborhood. It looked more like an elegant hotel than a nursing home, with its brick facade and well-maintained landscaping. David parked in the visitor's lot, and we walked together toward the main entrance. There were several elderly residents sitting on benches in the courtyard, and they looked content enough, chatting with each other or reading books in the afternoon sunshine. The lobby was impressive: high ceilings, comfortable seating areas, and a reception desk staffed by a young woman with a warm smile. Everything smelled clean and fresh, without the institutional odors I'd been dreading. "Mrs. Wood?" A middle-aged woman in a navy blue suit approached us with an extended hand. "I'm Margaret Peterson, the director here at Meadowbrook. Your son tells me you're interested in learning more about our community." I shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. "We're just looking," I said quickly. "Just getting information for the future." "Of course," she said smoothly. "That's exactly the right approach. It's always better to explore your options before you actually need them. Shall we start with a tour of our common areas?" Margaret Peterson was clearly an expert at this. She guided us through the facility with practiced ease, pointing out the dining room with its cloth napkins and fresh flowers on every table, the library with its comfortable reading chairs and extensive collection of books, the activity rooms where residents were engaged in everything from watercolor painting to card games. Everything was lovely. Everything was designed to make me feel like this was a place where I could be happy, where I could maintain my dignity and independence while still having the support I might need as I got older. The staff members we encountered were genuinely friendly, and the residents seemed well cared for and content. "Now, let me show you one of our available units," Margaret said, leading us down a carpeted hallway lined with cheerful artwork. "This is one of our most popular floor plans." She opened the door to reveal a spacious one-bedroom apartment with a small kitchen, a comfortable living area, and large windows that looked out onto the courtyard. The decor was neutral but pleasant, and I could see how someone could make it feel like home with their own furniture and personal belongings. "The nice thing about this particular unit," Margaret was saying, "is that it comes available immediately. Some of our other options have waiting lists, but if someone were interested in this one, they could move in right away." David was asking questions about meal plans and medical services, and I found myself tuning out their conversation as I walked around the apartment. It wasn't that it was unpleasant. It was actually quite nice. But it wasn't home. It wasn't the house where Robert and I had built our life together, where I'd raised David, where every room held memories that went back decades. "What do you think, Mom?" David's voice broke through my reverie. "It's very nice," I said honestly. "But as I said, I'm not ready to make any changes right now." Margaret Peterson smiled. "Of course, this is a big decision, and it shouldn't be rushed. Why don't I give you some information to take home, and you can think it over. There's no pressure at all." She handed me a folder full of brochures and price lists, and I accepted them politely, knowing I'd probably never look at them again. David thanked her profusely and shook her hand with the enthusiasm of a satisfied customer. "That went well," he said, as we walked back to his car. "What did you honestly think?" "I thought it was very nice," I said. "The staff seems caring, and the facilities are certainly impressive. But David, I want to be very clear about something. I'm not ready to leave my home. I may never be ready. I need you to understand that and respect it." "Absolutely," he said, opening the car door for me. "I completely understand. I just wanted you to know that there are good options out there if you ever change your mind." The drive home was pleasant. David was in a good mood, chatting about his work and asking about my garden. When we pulled into my driveway, he walked me to the door and gave me a hug that felt genuine and loving. "I'm glad we did this," he said. "Even if nothing comes of it, at least now I know you've seen what's available." "Yes," I agreed. "And now you know that I'm perfectly happy where I am." He kissed my cheek and headed back to his car. "I'll call you tomorrow, Mom. Love you." "Love you too, sweetheart." I watched him drive away, then went inside to my quiet house. I put the Meadowbrook folder on the kitchen counter and went upstairs to change out of my good clothes. In the mirror, I caught sight of myself and realized that David had been right about one thing. I did look perfectly presentable even without my weekly hair appointment. But that wasn't the point. The point was that my routine mattered to me, and he'd dismissed it as unimportant. Still, I pushed the thought away. David loved me and was concerned about my welfare. There was nothing wrong with that. If anything, I should be grateful to have a son who cared so much about my future. I never looked at the Meadowbrook folder again. I meant to throw it away, but somehow it just stayed there on the kitchen counter, gathering dust among the mail and grocery store circulars. I forgot about it entirely until 3 weeks later, when David showed up at my door again. This time, he wasn't alone. Sharon was with him, looking perfectly put together as always in her designer jeans and cashmere sweater. Her smile was a little too bright, her manner a little too enthusiastic. "Jenny," she said, using the nickname she'd adopted for me after she and David got married. "You look wonderful. David's been telling me all about your visit to Meadowbrook. How exciting." Exciting wasn't the word I would have chosen, but I invited them in and offered coffee. Sharon declined, saying she was trying to cut back on caffeine, but David accepted a cup. "Actually, Mom," he said, settling into Robert's chair again, "we wanted to talk to you about Meadowbrook. Sharon and I have been discussing your situation, and we both think it might be time to seriously consider making a move." I felt that familiar stab of defensiveness. My situation? What situation? Sharon leaned forward on the couch, her expression earnest. "Jenny, we're just concerned about you. Living alone in this big house, managing everything by yourself. It's a lot for anyone, especially someone your age. Someone my age." There it was again, that subtle reminder that I was old, that I was somehow less capable than I'd been before. But I was the same person I'd always been. Yes, I moved a little more slowly than I used to, and yes, I sometimes forgot where I'd put my reading glasses. But my mind was sharp, my health was good, and I was perfectly capable of taking care of myself. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but I'm managing just fine." David and Sharon exchanged a look that I couldn't interpret. It was Sharon who spoke next. "Jenny, we know you think you're managing fine, and maybe you are right now. But what about 6 months from now? A year from now? Wouldn't it be better to make this transition while you're still healthy and able to enjoy it, rather than waiting until there's a crisis?" "What transition?" I asked. "I haven't agreed to any transition." David set down his coffee cup. "Mom, I called Margaret Peterson yesterday. That unit we looked at is still available, but she says it probably won't be for much longer. Places like Meadowbrook have waiting lists, and if you want to get in, you need to act quickly. I stared at him in shock. You called them without discussing it with me first? I was just getting information, he said defensively. I thought, you'd want to know that the option was still there. David, I told you very clearly that I'm not ready to make any changes. I told you I may never be ready. Why would you call them and give them the impression that I'm interested? Sharon jumped in before David could answer. Jenny, nobody's trying to pressure you. We're just trying to help you plan for your future. You're so lucky to have options like Meadowbrook. Some people wait years to get into a place that nice. But I don't want to get into any place, I said, my voice rising slightly. I want to stay in my own home. This is where I belong. This is where Robert and I built our life together. This is where I raised David. I can't believe you're both sitting here trying to convince me to leave it. David's expression softened. Mom, I know this house means a lot to you. It means a lot to me too. But be practical. It's way too big for one person. The maintenance alone must be overwhelming. And what about the property taxes? The utilities? You could sell this place and use the money to pay for a beautiful apartment at Meadowbrook with all your needs taken care of. The money. There it was. I should have seen it coming, but somehow I hadn't. David wasn't just concerned about my welfare. He was thinking about the financial burden of maintaining me in my own home versus the efficiency of having me tucked away in an assisted living facility. The expenses are manageable, I said quietly. Your father left me very well provided for, and I've been careful with my money over the years. I know Dad left you comfortable, David said, but Mom, you're spending money on this house that you could be saving for your future care. What if you need medical attention down the road? What if you need specialized care that isn't covered by insurance? Wouldn't it be smarter to conserve your resources now while you still can? I looked at my son, really looked at him, and for the first time, I began to see past the caring facade to something that made my stomach turn. He was calculating. He was thinking about my money, about my estate, about what would be left for him when I was gone. I think you both should leave now, I said, standing up from my chair. I need some time to think about this conversation. David looked genuinely surprised. Mom, we didn't mean to upset you. We're just trying to help. I know what you think. You're doing, I said, walking toward the front door. But I need you to understand something very clearly. This is my life, my home, and my decision. I will not be bullied or manipulated into doing something I don't want to do. Sharon gathered her purse and followed David to the door. Jenny, please don't be angry with us. We love you and we just want what's best for you. If you love me, I said, then you'll respect my wishes and stop pressuring me to leave my home. After they left, I sat in my living room for a long time, looking at the family photos on the mantel. There was David at age 5, grinning as he showed off a missing tooth. David at his high school graduation, looking so proud in his cap and gown. David on his wedding day, handsome in his tuxedo with Sharon beautiful beside him in her white dress. When had he changed? When had my sweet, loving son become someone who saw me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be cherished? Or had he always been this way, and I'd just been too blind to see it? I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about what David had said about the house being too big, too expensive, too much for me to handle. Was he right? Was I being foolishly stubborn, clinging to a home that was no longer practical for my circumstances? By morning, I'd convinced myself that I was overreacting. David loved me. He was concerned about my future, and maybe his concerns were valid. Maybe I should at least consider the possibility that a change might be good for me. When he called, the next day I was ready to listen. Mom, I hope you're not still upset about yesterday. Sharon and I talked about it last night, and we realized we came on too strong. We're sorry. Thank you for saying that, I said. I appreciate the apology. The thing is, though, Mom, I'm really worried about you. Not just about the house, but about you being alone so much. When's the last time you had a real conversation with someone other than me or Sharon? When's the last time you did something social, something fun? I tried to think of an answer and realized I couldn't come up with one easily. My social circle had shrunk over the years as friends moved away or passed away. I'd been spending more and more time alone, and I hadn't really noticed until David pointed it out. Maybe you have a point, I admitted. I know I do. And Mom, that's why I think Meadowbrook could be so good for you. You'd have people to talk to, activities to participate in, a whole community of people in similar situations. You wouldn't be isolated anymore. He was making sense. I hated to admit it, but he was making sense. What if we went back for another visit? He suggested. This time, maybe we could stay for lunch, meet some of the residents, get a better feel for what life there would actually be like. I found myself agreeing. All right, we can do that. Great. I'll call Margaret Peterson and set it up. And Mom? Thank you for keeping an open mind about this. I know it's not easy. The second visit to Meadowbrook was different from the first. This time, Margaret Peterson introduced me to several residents, and I had to admit they seemed genuinely happy. There was Eleanor, a former teacher who told me about the book club she'd started. There was Frank, a retired engineer who was building model airplanes in the crafts room. There was Mary, whose children lived in different states, and who said she'd never been less lonely than she'd been since moving to Meadowbrook. We stayed for lunch, and I was impressed by the quality of the food and the liveliness of the conversation at our table. Everyone was friendly and welcoming, and several people mentioned how nice it would be to have a new resident join their community. What do you think? David asked as we walked back to his car. I think it's lovely, I said honestly. But David, I still don't feel ready to make such a big change. I understand, he said. But Mom, what if I told you that I'd help with everything? The packing, the moving, getting your apartment set up exactly the way you want it? You wouldn't have to do any of the hard work. That's very generous of you, I said. But it's not about the logistics. It's about leaving the home where I've been happy for almost 40 years. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Mom, can I be completely honest with you about something? Of course. I'm scared. I'm scared that something's going to happen to you while you're alone in that house, and I won't be there to help. I'm scared that you'll fall again, or have a medical emergency, or just need help with something, and there won't be anyone around. I lie awake at night worrying about you. His voice broke a little on the last words, and I felt my heart melt. This was my son, my baby, telling me that he was frightened for my safety. How could I dismiss that? How could I ignore his very real concerns just because I was attached to a house? I don't want you to worry about me, I said softly. Then, help me not worry. Come live at Meadowbrook where I'll know you're safe and cared for. Please, Mom. Do it for me if you won't do it for yourself. I should have said no. I should have insisted on my right to make my own decisions about my own life. But I loved my son, and I couldn't bear the thought of him lying awake at night, worrying about me. All right, I said quietly. If it means that much to you, I'll do it. David's face lit up with relief and gratitude. He reached over and squeezed my hand. Thank you, Mom. You won't regret this, I promise. The next week passed in a blur of activity. David was true to his word about helping with everything. He arranged for a moving company, helped me decide which furniture would fit in my new apartment, and even hired someone to clean my house for the sale. Wait, the sale? David, I said when he mentioned it casually. I never said anything about selling the house. Well, Mom, you can't afford to maintain two places, and honestly, what's the point of keeping it? You're not going to be living there anymore. But what if I want to come back? What if I try Meadowbrook and decide it's not for me? David's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Mom, that's not going to happen. You're going to love it there. And even if you didn't, the house is too much for you. We've already established that. I felt a flutter of panic. David, I want to keep the house. At least for now. At least until I'm sure about Meadowbrook. Mom, be reasonable. The house is going to sit empty, deteriorating, costing you money. Every month. It makes much more sense to sell it now while the market is good. It's my house, I said, my voice rising. It's my decision whether to sell it or not. Of course it is, David said quickly. I didn't mean to imply otherwise. It's just that from a practical standpoint. I don't care about the practical standpoint right now, I interrupted. I care about having a safety net. I care about knowing that if things don't work out at Meadowbrook, I have somewhere to go back to. David sighed. All right, Mom. We'll keep the house for now. But I really think you're making this harder on yourself than it needs to be. Moving day arrived faster than I'd expected. The movers came early in the morning, and by afternoon, most of my belongings were either in my new apartment at Meadowbrook or in storage. David had been incredibly helpful, directing the movers and making sure everything went smoothly. My new apartment looked lovely with my own furniture and personal belongings. David had even arranged for fresh flowers to be waiting for me, and the staff at Meadowbrook had prepared a welcome basket with fruit and chocolates. See? David said, looking around the apartment with satisfaction. It's perfect. It's like a beautiful hotel room, but it's all yours. I nodded and smiled, trying to feel as enthusiastic as he sounded. The apartment was beautiful, and everyone at Meadowbrook had been wonderfully welcoming. I had no reason to feel the hollow ache in my chest or the persistent sense that I'd made a terrible mistake. I should get going, David said, checking his watch. Sharon's cooking dinner tonight, and I promised I'd be home by 6, but I'll call you tomorrow, and maybe we can have lunch together later this week. That sounds nice, I said. He kissed my cheek and headed for the door. I'm proud of you, Mom. I know this wasn't easy, but you did the right thing. After he left, I sat in my new living room, surrounded by familiar furniture in an unfamiliar place. Through the window, I could see the courtyard where several residents were enjoying the evening air. It was peaceful and pleasant, and I had no reason to feel anything but content. So why did I feel like I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life? That first night at Meadowbrook, I barely slept. The bed was comfortable, the room was quiet, and I had no real complaints about my accommodations. But it wasn't home. The sounds were different. The smells were different. And even though I was surrounded by people just a few feet away on either side, I felt more alone than I had in years. I told myself it would get better. Moving was always difficult, and it would take time to adjust. Everyone had warned me about that, and I'd been prepared for some initial homesickness. But days passed, then weeks, and the feeling didn't improve. If anything, it got worse. I participated in activities, ate meals in the dining room, and made polite conversation with other residents. But I felt like I was playing a role rather than living my life. David called regularly, just as he'd promised. He always sounded cheerful and upbeat, asking about my activities and telling me about his work. When I mentioned that I was having trouble adjusting, he was sympathetic but encouraging. It just takes time, Mom. Everyone goes through an adjustment period. Give it a few more weeks and you'll feel right at home. But I didn't feel right at home. I felt like a visitor who had overstayed her welcome. It was during my 3rd week at Meadowbrook that I realized something that made my blood run cold. I was sitting in the lobby, waiting for David to pick me up for lunch, when I overheard a conversation between 2 staff members. "How's Mrs. Chen adjusting?" one asked. "Better than most," the other replied. "Her daughter says she's planning to put the house on the market next month. Says there's no point in waiting when they know she's not going back." Not going back, The words hit me like a physical blow. I thought about my own house, sitting empty while I tried to adjust to life at Meadowbrook. David had been pushing me to put it on the market almost from the day I'd moved in. "Just think about it, Mom," he'd say. "It's costing you money to maintain an empty house, and property values are really good right now." But I'd insisted on keeping it, and he'd agreed, albeit reluctantly. Hadn't he? When David arrived for lunch, I was quiet and distracted. He chatted about his work and asked about my morning activities, but I was barely listening. I was thinking about Mrs. Chen and her daughter, about houses being sold and bridges being burned. "David," I said suddenly, interrupting his story about a difficult client, "I want to go see the house." "The house?" He looked confused. "What house?" "My house. Our house. I want to go see it." David's expression became carefully neutral. "Mom, I don't think that's a good idea. It's just going to make you sad and confused. You're doing so well at Meadowbrook. Why torture yourself?" "I'm not torturing myself. I just want to see my home." "It's not your home anymore," David said gently. "Meadowbrook is your home now." The way he said it, so final, so absolute, sent a chill down my spine. "David, I want to see the house. Today, after lunch." "Mom." "David, I'm not asking you. I'm telling you. Take me to see my house or I'll call a taxi and go by myself." He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker across his face that I'd never seen before. Annoyance, frustration, and something else that made my heart skip a beat. Fear. "All right," he said finally. "We'll drive by the house after lunch. But I'm warning you, Mom, it's going to upset you, and I don't want to hear any complaints afterward." Lunch was tense. David made small talk about the weather and the activities at Meadowbrook, but there was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before. I found myself studying his face, looking for signs of the sweet, caring son I thought I knew, and finding instead a stranger who seemed increasingly irritated by my requests. The drive to my house took 15 minutes. As we turned onto my street, I felt my heart begin to pound with anticipation. In a few moments, I'd see my beautiful home with its rose garden and the oak tree that Robert had planted when David was born. But when David's car pulled into the driveway, I saw something that made me gasp out loud. There was a sold sign on the front lawn. I stared at the sign in shock, unable to process what I was seeing. My house, my beautiful, beloved home, had been sold. Without my knowledge, without my permission. "David," I whispered, "what is this?" David turned off the engine and sat quietly for a moment, not meeting my eyes. The silence in David's car stretched between us like a chasm. I couldn't take my eyes off that sold sign, the red letters burning into my vision like a brand. My house, the house where I'd lived for 38 years, where I'd raised my son, where my husband had drawn his last breath, had been sold without my knowledge or consent. "David." My voice came out as barely a whisper. "Tell me what this means." He still wouldn't look at me. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white, and I could see a muscle jumping in his jaw. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, like he was trying very hard not to lose his temper. "Mom, I was going to tell you, I was waiting for the right time." "The right time for what? To tell me that you sold my house without my permission?" "I didn't sell it without your permission," he said, finally turning to face me. "You signed papers giving me power of attorney to handle your affairs while you were transitioning to Meadowbrook. It was all completely legal." I stared at him in shock. "I never signed any such papers." "Yes, you did, the day before you moved. Remember? I brought over some documents for you to sign, and I explained that it was just paperwork to make the transition easier. Insurance forms, change of address notifications, that sort of thing." A cold certainty began to settle in my chest, I remembered that day. David had indeed brought over a stack of papers, and I'd been so overwhelmed with the emotions of leaving my home that I'd barely glanced at them before signing. He'd been standing over me, pointing to signature lines and saying things, like just standard forms and nothing important, just logistics. "You tricked me," I said, my voice growing stronger with anger. "You deliberately misrepresented what those papers were." "I didn't trick you. I protected you. Mom, you were getting emotional and irrational about keeping the house. Someone had to make the practical decisions." Practical decisions? David, that house was my security. It was my fallback plan if things didn't work out at Meadowbrook. You took away my choice. David's careful control finally cracked. "Your choice? Mom, what choice? You can't live alone anymore. You proved that when you fell down the stairs. And could have died if Mrs. Henderson next door hadn't checked on you. You can't maintain a house that size. You can't drive safely anymore. Don't think I haven't noticed how you avoid driving at night or in bad weather. You can't even remember to take your medications consistently." Each word hit me like a slap. I remember my medications just fine. "Do you? Then why did I find that pill organizer only half used when I was packing up your bathroom? Why were there expired prescriptions sitting in your medicine cabinet? Mom, you're not as capable as you think you are, and someone had to step in before you hurt yourself or worse." I felt tears stinging my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "Even if all of that were true, and I'm not saying it is, you had no right to make that decision for me. That house was mine. Those were my belongings, my memories, my life. And now that life is at Meadowbrook, where you're safe and cared for. Mom, I know this is hard, but you need to trust me. I'm doing what's best for you." "What's best for me or what's best for you?" David's face darkened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means that maintaining my house was expensive, wasn't it? It means that as long as I lived there independently, you couldn't be sure about your inheritance. It means that selling the house and putting me in assisted living guarantees that there will be something left for you when I'm gone." That's a terrible thing to say. David's voice was cold now, all pretense of patience gone. "I can't believe you'd accuse me of something like that. Then explain to me why you felt it was necessary to trick me into signing away my rights. Explain to me why you sold my house 3 weeks after I moved out. Explain to me why you never mentioned that the papers I was signing included a power of attorney." "Because I knew you'd react exactly like this. I knew you'd get emotional and irrational and refuse to do what was obviously the right thing. Someone had to be the adult. In this situation, Mom, and apparently that someone was me." The condescension in his voice was like acid. This man sitting beside me, this stranger who looked like my son but spoke to me like I was a confused child, was telling me that he'd deceived me for my own good. That he'd stripped away my autonomy because he knew better than I did what I needed. "Take me back to Meadowbrook," I said quietly. "Mom, I know you're upset, but take me back now." The drive back was silent except for the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. I stared out the window at the familiar streets of my neighborhood, knowing that I no longer had any claim to this place. I was truly homeless now, dependent entirely on the charity of Meadowbrook Assisted Living and the goodwill of a son who had proven himself willing to lie to me when it suited his purposes. When we pulled into the Meadowbrook parking lot, David tried one more time to smooth things over. "Mom, I know you're angry right now, but in a few months, you'll see that this was the right decision. You'll be settled and happy at Meadowbrook, and you won't even miss the house." I turned to look at him, really look at him, and tried to find some trace of the little boy who used to tell me I was the bravest person in the world. But all I saw was a middle-aged man who thought he knew what was best for everyone and felt entitled to make decisions for other people without their consent. "David," I said slowly, "I want you to understand something very clearly. What you did to me today, the lying, the deception, the complete disregard for my wishes, has changed everything between us. I don't know if I can forgive this. Mom, you're being dramatic. In 6 months, you'll thank me for this. No, I said, opening the car door. I won't. I walked into Meadowbrook without looking back, and I didn't answer when David called my name. I went straight to my apartment and closed the door behind me, then sat in my familiar armchair and tried to process what had just happened to my life. The apartment felt different now. Before, it had been a temporary refuge, a place I was trying out while keeping my real home as a safety net. Now it was simply a room where I would live until I died, because I had nowhere else to go. David had made sure of that. I tried to think rationally about my situation. I had enough money to live comfortably at Meadowbrook for many years. The staff was kind, the facilities were excellent, and the other residents were pleasant company. By any objective measure, I should be grateful for my circumstances, but I felt like a prisoner. That evening, I skipped dinner in the dining room and asked for a tray to be brought to my apartment. I couldn't face making conversation with the other residents, couldn't pretend to be grateful and content when I felt like my world had been torn apart. Margaret Peterson knocked on my door around 8 o'clock. Mrs. Wood, I heard you weren't feeling well today. Is there anything I can do for you? I invited her in, and she sat on my couch with the practiced ease of someone who was used to dealing with distressed residents. Would you like to talk about what's troubling you? She asked gently. I found myself telling her the whole story, about David's pressure to move to Meadowbrook, about the papers I'd signed without understanding what they were, about discovering that my house had been sold without my knowledge. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious as I talked. Mrs. Wood, she said when I finished, I'm going to be very direct with you. What your son did was not uncommon, but it was wrong. Many adult children convince their elderly parents to sign documents they don't fully understand, especially when emotions are running high. It's a form of financial abuse, even when it's done with good intentions. Financial abuse. The words hit me like a physical blow. My own son had financially abused me. The question now, Margaret continued, is what you want to do about it. Do you have a copy of the power of attorney documents you signed? I shook my head. David said he'd bring me copies, but he never did. That's another red flag. You're entitled to copies of any legal documents you sign. I'd recommend that you contact a lawyer and have them review your situation. There may be legal remedies available to you. But what good would that do now? The house is already sold. Maybe, maybe not. If the power of attorney was obtained through deception, it might be invalidated. And even if the sale stands, you might be entitled to damages. More importantly, you might be able to revoke the power of attorney so that your son can't make any more decisions on your behalf. I thought about this for a long time after Margaret left. The idea of taking legal action against my own son felt both impossible and necessary. Impossible, because he was my child, the baby I'd carried and nursed and loved unconditionally for 43 years. Necessary because he'd proven that he couldn't be trusted with my welfare or my dignity. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the signs I'd missed, all the little moments that should have warned me what David was planning. The way he'd dismissed my concerns about moving too quickly. The way he'd pressured me to sign papers without reading them carefully. The way he'd immediately started talking about selling the house as soon as I'd agreed to try Meadowbrook. I thought about Sharon too, and her role in all of this. Had she known what David was planning? Had they discussed my situation together, deciding between them what was best for me without ever consulting me? The thought made me sick to my stomach. The next morning, I called the law firm that had handled Robert's estate. The receptionist put me through to James Morrison, the attorney who had helped us with our wills and other legal matters over the years. Jenny, he said warmly, it's good to hear from you. How are you settling in at Meadowbrook? That's actually what I'm calling about, Jim. I need to discuss some legal issues that have come up." I told him the whole story, and his silence grew longer and more ominous as I talked. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Jenny," he said finally, "I think you need to come in and see me as soon as possible. Can you get here today?" "I don't drive anymore," I said, realizing as I said it that David had been right about at least that much. "And I don't want to ask David to bring me." "I'll send a car for you. This is important enough that it can't wait." 2 hours later, I was sitting in Jim Morrison's office, looking at copies of the documents I'd signed the day before moving to Meadowbrook. Reading them now with a clear head and no emotional pressure, I felt sick to my stomach. The power of attorney was broad and comprehensive, giving David control over all of my financial affairs, my healthcare decisions, and my living arrangements. There were also documents transferring the deed of my house into David's name for estate planning purposes, and papers authorizing him to access all of my bank accounts and investment portfolios. "Jenny," Jim said gently, "your son now has complete legal control over your life. He can make medical decisions for you, move your money around, even commit you to a nursing home against your will if he chooses to." But I didn't understand what I was signing. He told me it was just routine paperwork. "I believe you. The question is whether we can prove that in court. Tell me exactly what David said to you when he presented these papers." I recounted the conversation as best I could remember it, and Jim took notes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked thoughtful. "We might have grounds to challenge the power of attorney based on undue influence and misrepresentation. But Jenny, I have to warn you that fighting this will be expensive and emotionally draining, and David will almost certainly contest any legal action you take. Are you prepared for that kind of battle with your son?" I thought about it for a long moment. Was I prepared to essentially declare war on my only child? Was I prepared to air our family's dirty laundry in court and possibly destroy our relationship forever? Then I thought about how David had spoken to me the day before, calling me irrational and emotional, dismissing my concerns like I was a confused child who couldn't be trusted to make decisions about her own life. "Yes," I said firmly. "I'm prepared." Jim nodded. "All right. The first thing we need to do is file a motion to revoke the power of attorney. Then we'll petition the court to freeze your assets so that David can't make any more financial decisions without court approval. Depending on what we find when we review your accounts, we might also have grounds for a lawsuit seeking damages." Over the next week, I learned things about my own financial situation that left me reeling. Jim's investigation revealed that David hadn't just sold my house. He'd also moved a significant portion of my investment portfolio into accounts that he controlled. Money that Robert and I had saved carefully over decades of marriage, money that was supposed to ensure my security in my old age, had been transferred out of my name and into David's. "The good news," Jim told me during our second meeting, "is that we can trace all of these transactions. David was sloppy about covering his tracks, probably because he assumed you'd never question what he was doing. The bad news is that unwinding these transactions is going to take time, and David is going to fight us every step of the way." As if summoned by our conversation, David called that evening. I was back in my apartment at Meadowbrook, trying to process everything I'd learned about my financial situation when the phone rang. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice carefully cheerful. "I just wanted to check on you. I heard from Margaret Peterson that you seemed upset yesterday." "I wonder why that might be," I said dryly. "Mom, I hope you're not still dwelling on the house situation. I really think it's time to move forward and focus on settling in at Meadowbrook." "Actually, David, I've been thinking a lot about moving forward. In fact, I've been talking to Jim Morrison about some legal matters." The silence on the other end of the phone was telling. When David finally spoke, his voice had lost all traces of artificial cheer. "What kind of legal matters?" "The kind that involve power of attorney documents and financial transactions that were made without my full understanding or consent." "Mom, you're making a mistake. You signed those papers willingly, and everything I've done has been in your best interests. If you start making wild accusations and involving lawyers, you're going to regret it." The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and it crystallized something inside me. This wasn't my loving son speaking to me with concern for my welfare. This was a man who'd been caught manipulating and stealing from his elderly mother, and who was now trying to intimidate me into silence. "David," I said calmly, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. I know what you've done. I know about the house, about the money you've moved out of my accounts, about the documents you tricked me into signing. And I know that what you've done is not just morally wrong, it's illegal. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. And I know that you have 48 hours to return control of my finances to me voluntarily, or I'm going to pursue every legal remedy available to me." "Mom, you're making a huge mistake. You're going to destroy our relationship over money." "I'm not destroying our relationship over money, David. You destroyed our relationship when you decided to lie to me and steal from me. The money is just evidence of how little you actually respect me." David's voice turned cold. "Fine. If that's the way you want to play this, we'll play it your way. But don't expect me to come running when you need help. Don't expect me to visit you or call you or pretend that we have a relationship anymore. You've made your choice." "Yes," I said quietly. "I have." He hung up without saying goodbye, and I sat in my apartment for a long time afterward, trying to process what had just happened. In the space of a week, I'd lost my home and discovered that my son was a thief and a liar. I'd also discovered that I was stronger than I'd given myself credit for. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings and paperwork. Jim Morrison worked tirelessly to unravel the financial mess that David had created, and slowly, piece by piece, we began to regain control of my assets. The power of attorney was revoked by court order, and David was legally prohibited from accessing my accounts or making any decisions on my behalf. But the emotional toll was enormous. David made good on his threat to cut off contact with me. He didn't call, didn't visit, and didn't respond to the messages I left for him. Sharon was equally absent from my life, and I realized that whatever relationship I'd thought we had was entirely dependent on my willingness to be a compliant, grateful mother-in-law who didn't ask difficult questions. I found myself grieving, not just for the relationship I'd lost, but for the relationship I'd thought I had. For 43 years, I'd believed that David loved me unconditionally, that he valued my opinions and respected my autonomy. Learning that he saw me as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to his inheritance was devastating in ways I hadn't expected. The other residents at Meadowbrook were kind and supportive during this difficult time. Eleanor, the former teacher, who ran the book club, became a particular friend and confidant. She'd been through her own family drama when her children had tried to pressure her into signing over control of her finances, so she understood what I was going through in ways that others couldn't. "The hardest part," she told me one afternoon as we sat in the garden, "isn't losing the money, or even losing the house. It's losing the illusion that your children see you as a person worthy of respect and dignity." She was right. I could have lived with David's genuine concern for my safety. I could have forgiven him for pushing me to move to Meadowbrook if it had really been about my welfare. But I couldn't forgive the calculated way he'd manipulated me, or the contempt he'd shown for my intelligence and my right to make my own decisions. 3 months after our confrontation, I received a letter from David's attorney. It was cold and formal, outlining his position that all of his actions had been legal and in my best interests, and demanding that I cease what the letter called my harassment of him through the legal system. Reading that letter, I felt something inside me shift and harden. David wasn't just unrepentant about what he'd done. He was actively portraying himself as the victim of my unreasonable demands for autonomy and honesty. He genuinely seemed to believe that he was the injured party in this situation, That's when I decided that revoking the power of attorney and recovering my stolen assets wasn't enough. David needed to face real consequences for what he'd done, and he needed to understand that his actions had permanently altered the course of his life in ways he hadn't anticipated. I called Jim Morrison and asked him to schedule a meeting. When I arrived at his office the next day, I had a very specific request. "Jim, I want to change my will." He looked at me carefully. "Jenny, you should think very hard about this. Disinheriting David is a decision that can't be easily undone. And if you're doing it out of anger—" "I'm not doing it out of anger," I interrupted. "I'm doing it out of clarity. David has shown me exactly how he views our relationship and exactly how much respect he has for me as a person. He's also shown me that he feels entitled to my money and my property regardless of how he treats me. I see no reason to reward that behavior with an inheritance." Jim was quiet for a long moment. "All right. If you're certain about this, we can draft a new will. But I'd recommend that you take some time to think about it first. Maybe wait a few more months and see if David comes to his senses and tries to repair your relationship. He's had 3 months to apologize, or even to acknowledge that what he did was wrong. Instead, he's hired a lawyer to threaten me. That tells me everything I need to know about his character and his priorities." Over the next several weeks, Jim and I worked together to create a new will that reflected my changed understanding of my family situation. The process was both liberating and heartbreaking. Liberating, because I was finally taking control of my own destiny instead of allowing David to manipulate me through a combination of guilt and false concern. Heartbreaking because it represented the final acknowledgement that the loving relationship I'd thought I had with my son had been largely an illusion. I left small bequests to several charities that Robert and I had supported over the years, including the animal shelter where we'd gotten our dog Max, and the library where I'd volunteered for 20 years. I left a substantial amount to Meadowbrook, assisted living to establish a fund for residents who couldn't afford the full cost of care. And I left the remainder, the vast majority of my estate, to a foundation that provided legal assistance to elderly people who were victims of financial abuse by family members. The irony wasn't lost on me. David's greed and manipulation had led directly to his complete disinheritance, and the money he'd been so eager to control would now be used to help other elderly people fight against exactly the kind of abuse he'd perpetrated against me. When the new will was finalized, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced since before David had first brought up the idea of moving to Meadowbrook. I was no longer a victim of his manipulation. I was no longer dependent on his goodwill, or subject to his whims about my living situation or my finances. I was free. That freedom came with a price, of course. The holidays were particularly difficult. Thanksgiving and Christmas had always been times when David, Sharon, and I would gather together to share meals and exchange gifts. This year, I spent both holidays at Meadowbrook, participating in the facility's celebrations and trying to create new traditions with my fellow residents. It wasn't the same as having family, but it was better than pretending to have a relationship with people who saw me as a burden rather than a beloved mother and mother-in-law. Eleanor invited me to join her and several other residents for a Christmas Eve dinner in the private dining room, and we shared stories about Christmases past, and talked about what the holiday meant to us now that we were in this stage of our lives. "You know," said Frank, the retired engineer who built model airplanes, "I used to think that family was the most important thing in the world, but I've learned that respect and kindness are more important than blood relations. I'd rather spend the holidays with people who treat me well than with family members who make me feel like a nuisance." Everyone at the table nodded in agreement, and I realized that I wasn't the only one who'd had to learn difficult lessons about family loyalty and what it really meant. As winter turned to spring, I settled into a routine at Meadowbrook that was actually quite pleasant. I joined Eleanor's book club and discovered that I enjoyed discussing literature with people who'd had time to read widely and think deeply about what they'd read. I started taking art classes and found that I had a talent for watercolor painting that I'd never known existed. I even began volunteering in the facility's library, helping to catalog new books and organize reading programs for residents with vision problems. For the first time in months, I was genuinely happy, not the artificial happiness that comes from pretending everything is fine when it isn't, but the real contentment that comes from living authentically and being surrounded by people who value and respect you. It was during this period of contentment that I received an unexpected phone call. I was in my apartment one afternoon, working on a watercolor of the courtyard garden when the phone rang. "Mrs. Wood? This is Detective Sarah Martinez with the County Fraud Division. I'm calling about a complaint that's been filed regarding financial exploitation of an elderly person. I wonder if I could speak with you about your son, David Wood." My heart began to pound. What kind of complaint? "We've received information suggesting that Mr. Wood may have engaged in a pattern of financial abuse against elderly family members. We're investigating several similar cases, and your name has come up as a potential victim. Would you be willing to speak with me about your experiences?" I thought about this for a moment. Taking civil action against David to recover my stolen assets was one thing. Cooperating with a criminal investigation was another matter entirely. If David was charged with financial crimes, he could face jail time. His insurance business could be ruined. His entire life could be destroyed. Then I thought about other elderly people who might be vulnerable to the same kind of manipulation that David had used against me. I thought about Mrs. Chen, whose daughter had convinced her to sell her house and move to assisted living. I thought about all the residents at Meadowbrook who'd told me similar stories about children and grandchildren who'd pressured them into giving up their autonomy and their assets. "Yes," I told Detective Martinez. "I'd be very willing to speak with you." The next week, Detective Martinez came to Meadowbrook to interview me. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a professional manner that put me at ease immediately. I told her everything. About David's pressure tactics, about the documents he'd tricked me into signing, about the financial assets he'd transferred without my knowledge or consent. "Mrs. Wood," she said when I finished, "what your son did to you meets the legal definition of financial exploitation of an elderly person, which is a felony in this state. We have evidence of similar behavior toward at least 3 other elderly clients of his insurance business. We believe he's been using his professional relationships to identify vulnerable targets and then manipulating them into giving him control over their finances." The scope of David's crimes was much broader than I'd realized. He hadn't just betrayed me. He'd been systematically targeting and exploiting elderly people for years, using his position of trust and his professional credentials to gain access to their assets. "What happens next?" I asked. "We're preparing to arrest Mr. Wood and file formal charges. We'll need you to testify if the case goes to trial. Are you prepared to do that?" I thought about facing David in court, about having to recount the details of his betrayal in front of a judge and jury. I thought about the media attention that a case like this might attract, and about having my family's private business exposed to public scrutiny. Then I thought about the other elderly people David had victimized, and about the ones he might victimize in the future if he wasn't stopped. "Yes," I said firmly. "I'm prepared to testify." A week later, I watched the local news coverage of David's arrest with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The reporter described the charges against him: multiple counts of financial exploitation of elderly persons, fraud, and conspiracy. His insurance license had been suspended pending the outcome of the case, and his business was effectively finished. Sharon appeared briefly on camera, walking quickly to her car while reporters shouted questions at her. She looked haggard and frightened, and I found myself feeling sorry for her despite everything. She'd benefited from David's crimes, but I wasn't sure she'd fully understood the extent of what he was doing. Several of my fellow residents at Meadowbrook congratulated me on my courage in coming forward, and I was surprised to discover that many of them had been following the case closely. Apparently, stories about adult children exploiting their elderly parents were all too common in their social circles. "You did the right thing," Eleanor told me as we sat in the garden after dinner. It took courage to stand up to your own son, but you may have saved other families from going through what you went through." I nodded, but I was still processing the complex emotions that David's arrest had stirred up. Part of me felt vindicated and empowered. I'd refused to be a victim, and I'd taken action to protect others from the same kind of abuse I'd suffered. But part of me felt heartbroken at the complete destruction of my relationship with my only child. That night, as I lay in bed thinking about everything that had happened over the past several months, I realized that my experience had taught me something important about family, love, and respect. Real love doesn't manipulate or deceive. Real love doesn't steal or betray. Real love respects the autonomy and dignity of the person being loved, even when, especially when, that person is elderly and vulnerable. David had never really loved me the way I'd thought he did. He'd loved what I could provide for him: financial security, social status, the ego boost that came from having a grateful and dependent mother. But he'd never loved me as a person worthy of honesty and respect. Understanding that was painful, but it was also liberating. I was no longer burdened with the impossible task of trying to maintain a relationship with someone who saw me as nothing more than a source of financial benefit. I was free to build genuine relationships with people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could give them. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I thought about the watercolor I'd been working on earlier, a painting of the courtyard garden with its carefully tended flowers and peaceful sitting areas. It was a picture of my new life at Meadowbrook, a life that was smaller in some ways than the one I'd had before, but richer in authenticity and genuine human connection. Tomorrow, Detective Martinez would call to update me on the progress of the case against David. Tomorrow, I'd attend Eleanor's book club and discuss the novel we'd been reading together. Tomorrow, I'd continue building the life I'd chosen for myself rather than the life that others had chosen for me. And for the first time in months, I was genuinely looking forward to tomorrow. 6 months had passed since David's arrest, and I was beginning to understand what it meant to live without the constant undercurrent of manipulation that had defined my relationship with my son for longer than I'd realized. The criminal case was moving forward steadily, with Detective Martinez keeping me informed of each development. David's lawyer was trying to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor was pushing for jail time given the number of victims and the substantial amounts of money involved. I'd been asked to provide a victim impact statement for the court, and I'd spent weeks thinking about what I wanted to say. How do you summarize the betrayal of having your own child systematically strip away your autonomy and dignity? How do you explain to a judge and jury what it feels like to discover that the person you love most in the world sees you as nothing more than an obstacle to their financial goals? The writing process was therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. Putting my experiences into words forced me to examine not just what David had done to me, but how I'd allowed it to happen. I'd been so eager to be a good mother, so determined to maintain our relationship at any cost, that I'd ignored red flags and made excuses for behavior that should have alarmed me. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the therapist that Margaret Peterson had recommended, helped me understand that what I'd experienced was a common pattern among elderly abuse victims. Family members often used love and concern as weapons, making their victims feel guilty for questioning their motives or resisting their control. Your son understood your psychological vulnerabilities, Dr. Hendricks explained during one of our sessions. He knew that your love for him and your desire to be a good mother would make you susceptible to manipulation. He used those positive qualities against you. The therapy sessions were difficult but necessary. I had to confront not just my anger at David, but my own feelings of shame and embarrassment at having been so thoroughly deceived. I had to learn to separate my identity as a mother from my identity as an individual worthy of respect and autonomy. It was during this period of self-reflection that I began to notice how different my daily life at Meadowbrook had become. Without the constant anxiety of trying to navigate David's manipulation and demands, I found myself genuinely enjoying activities and relationships that I'd been too distracted to appreciate before. The art classes had become a particular passion. My instructor, Maria Santos, was a retired art teacher who'd been volunteering at Meadowbrook for several years. She had an infectious enthusiasm for creativity and a gift for helping people discover artistic abilities they didn't know they possessed. "Jennifer," she said one afternoon as I worked on a portrait of Eleanor reading in the library, "you have a natural eye for capturing personality in your subjects. Have you ever considered entering any of your work in shows?" The idea had never occurred to me. Art had always been something I admired in museums, not something I imagined myself creating seriously. But Maria convinced me to submit several of my watercolors to a local community center exhibition, and to my amazement, 2 of them were accepted. The opening reception for the art show was on a Friday evening in late spring. Eleanor, Frank, and several other residents from Meadowbrook came to support me, and we made quite a group walking through the gallery together. Seeing my paintings hanging on the wall alongside work by other local artists was surreal and wonderful. "You should be proud of yourself," Eleanor said as we stood in front of my portrait of her. "This captures something essential about who I am, not just what I look like." That evening marked a turning point in how I saw myself. I wasn't just a victim of financial abuse or a lonely elderly woman whose son had abandoned her. I was an artist. I was someone who could create beauty and meaning with my own hands and vision. The confidence I gained from that experience began to affect other areas of my life. I volunteered to join the Meadowbrook Residents Council, which gave input on facility policies and activities. I started tutoring other residents in basic computer skills, drawing on knowledge I'd gained when I'd helped Robert manage his small business accounting in the years before his death. Most significantly, I began speaking to groups about elder abuse and financial exploitation. Detective Martinez had connected me with a nonprofit organization that educated seniors about protecting themselves from scams and manipulation. My first speaking engagement was at a senior center across town, and I was nervous about sharing such personal details of my experience with strangers. But something magical happened when I started talking about what David had done to me and how I'd fought back. The audience of about 30 seniors was completely engaged, asking thoughtful questions and sharing their own stories of family members who'd tried to control their finances or living situations. After the presentation, an elderly man named George approached me. "My daughter's been pressuring me to sell my house and move in with her family," he said. "She says it's because she's worried about my safety, but honestly, I think it's because she wants to get her hands on the equity. After hearing your story, I'm going to contact a lawyer before I sign anything." That conversation reinforced my growing understanding that David's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. There was an epidemic of adult children manipulating and exploiting their elderly parents, often using the language of love and concern to mask their true motives. I began speaking regularly at senior centers, community organizations, and even police departments that were training officers to recognize signs of elder abuse. Each time I told my story, I felt a little stronger and a little more certain that I'd made the right choices in fighting back against David's manipulation. The criminal case was scheduled to go to trial in early fall, and as the date approached, I found myself both dreading and anticipating the confrontation. I hadn't seen David since that awful day when he'd hung up on me after I'd confronted him about the stolen money. Detective Martinez had shown me photos of him taken during his arrest, and he'd looked older, more haggard than I remembered. Part of me still loved the memory of the little boy he'd been, the child who'd run to me for comfort when he was hurt or scared. But that child had grown into a man who'd seen his elderly mother as a mark to be conned, rather than a person to be cherished. Understanding that was still painful, but it no longer consumed me with grief the way it had in the early months after our confrontation. 2 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, I received an unexpected visitor. I was in the Meadowbrook library, helping to organize a new shipment of books when Margaret Peterson came to find me. Jennifer, you have a visitor, she said, her expression carefully neutral. It's your daughter-in-law. My heart started racing. I hadn't spoken to Sharon since David's arrest, and I had no idea what she might want from me. Margaret must have seen my anxiety, because she added quickly, "You don't have to see her if you don't want to. I can tell her you're not available." I considered that option for a moment, but curiosity won out over caution. "No, I'll see her. Could you ask her to meet me in the small conference room? I'd prefer to have some privacy." Sharon was waiting for me when I arrived at the conference room, and she looked terrible. Her usually perfect hair was unkempt, her makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes, and she'd lost weight in a way that made her look gaunt rather than fashionable. "Hello, Jennifer," she said, standing when I entered the room. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." We sat across from each other at the small table, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Sharon was twisting her wedding ring around her finger, a nervous habit I'd noticed during tense family gatherings in the past. "I suppose you're here about the trial," I said finally. "Among other things." Sharon's voice was hoarse, like she'd been crying or hadn't slept well in weeks. "Jennifer, I need you to know that I didn't understand what David was doing. I mean, I knew he was handling your finances and that he'd sold your house, but I thought you'd agreed to all of it. I thought it was what you wanted." I studied her face, trying to determine whether she was telling the truth. "You never questioned why I seemed so distressed about moving to Meadowbrook. You never wondered why David was so secretive about the financial arrangements." Sharon's eyes filled with tears. "I thought you were just having trouble adjusting. David told me that all elderly people go through that when they transition to assisted living. And the money stuff. He always handled our finances, so I didn't think it was unusual for him to handle yours too." There was something in her tone that made me believe she was being honest, at least about not understanding the full scope of what David had been doing. Sharon had always been somewhat passive in their marriage, deferring to David's judgment on major decisions and focusing on social activities and volunteer work. "What do you know now?" I asked. "I know that the FBI seized our computers and financial records. I know that David had been stealing money from other clients besides you. I know that he forged documents and lied to people who trusted him." She wiped her eyes with a tissue. "Jennifer, I know that what he did to you was unforgivable." The acknowledgement was unexpected, and I felt some of the tension in my chest begin to ease. For months, I'd wondered whether Sharon had been complicit in David's crimes or simply willfully blind to them. "Why are you here, Sharon?" "Because I wanted to apologize to you personally before the trial starts. Because I wanted you to know that I never intended for any of this to happen. And because—" She hesitated, looking down at her hands. "Because I'm divorcing David, and I wanted you to hear it from me first." This news was genuinely shocking. Sharon and David had been married for 15 years, and while their relationship had never seemed particularly passionate, I'd assumed it was stable and committed. "May I ask why?" "Because I can't be married to someone who would steal from his own mother. Because I can't trust him anymore. Because every time I look at him, I think about what he did to you, and I feel sick." Sharon looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Jennifer, you raised a good man. I don't know when or how he became someone else, but the David I married wouldn't have done what he did to you." We sat in silence for a moment, both processing the weight of what she'd said. I found myself feeling sorry for Sharon despite everything. She'd lost her husband and her marriage because of David's choices, and she was facing financial uncertainty as the wife of a man whose career and reputation were in ruins. "What will you do?" I asked. "I'm moving back to Ohio to be closer to my sister. I've already found a job there, and I'm hoping to start over somewhere that people don't know about this whole mess." She paused. "I know I don't have any right to ask you for anything, but I was hoping you might consider writing a letter to the court explaining that I wasn't involved in David's crimes." The prosecutor said it might help with my divorce settlement. I thought about this request. Sharon was asking me to potentially help her financially at a time when my own financial security had been damaged by her husband's crimes. But she seemed genuinely remorseful, and I believed her when she said she hadn't understood what David was doing. "I'll consider it," I said. "But Sharon, I need you to understand something. The damage David did to me wasn't just financial. He destroyed my trust in my own judgment and made me question everything I thought I knew about our family. That's not something that can be fixed with apologies or divorce papers." "I know," she said quietly. "I don't expect you to forgive me or David. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and that I think you're incredibly brave for fighting back the way you did." After Sharon left, I found myself thinking about forgiveness and what it meant in situations like mine. Did I forgive Sharon for her passive role in David's crimes? Did I forgive David for his deliberate betrayal of my trust? Did I need to forgive either of them in order to move forward with my own life? Dr. Hendricks and I discussed this extensively in our next session. "Forgiveness isn't something you owe to people who've wronged you," she explained. "It's something you do for yourself, when you're ready to let go of anger and resentment. But you don't have to forgive in order to heal." I realized that I'd already begun healing without worrying about forgiveness. My anger at David had evolved into something more like disappointment and sadness for the relationship we'd never really had. I wasn't consumed with hatred or bitterness, but I also wasn't ready to absolve him of responsibility for his choices. The trial began on a crisp October morning. The courthouse was an imposing brick building downtown, and I felt nervous as I walked up the steps with Jim Morrison beside me. Detective Martinez met us in the lobby and explained what would happen during my testimony. "The defense is going to try to portray you as a confused elderly woman who doesn't understand financial matters," she warned me. "They're going to suggest that David was acting in your best interests and that you're only upset because you don't understand what he was trying to do for you." I'd been expecting this strategy, and I'd prepared for it during several practice sessions with the prosecutor. The key was to remain calm and factual, to speak clearly about what David had said and done, and to avoid getting drawn into emotional responses that might make me seem unstable or unreliable. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with rows of wooden benches facing the judge's bench and the jury box. David was already seated at the defense table with his lawyer, and seeing him again after almost a year was jarring. He looked older and thinner, dressed in a suit that seemed too big for him. When our eyes met briefly, his expression was unreadable. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Maria Rodriguez, was a competent woman in her 40s who'd impressed me with her thorough understanding of the case and her genuine concern for the victims. She'd explained that David was facing multiple felony charges related to financial exploitation of elderly persons, and that if convicted on all counts, he could face up to 20 years in prison. My testimony lasted most of the morning. I walked through the timeline of events leading up to my move to Meadowbrook, explained how David had pressured me to sign documents I didn't understand, and described my discovery that my house had been sold without my knowledge. I spoke clearly and calmly, focusing on facts rather than emotions. The defense attorney, a smooth-talking man in an expensive suit, tried his best to rattle me during cross-examination. He suggested that I was confused about what I'd agreed to, that David had always acted with my knowledge and consent, and that I was unfairly blaming him for decisions I'd made willingly. "Mrs. Wood," he said, pacing in front of the witness stand, "isn't it true that you were having difficulty managing your finances and household responsibilities before you moved to Meadowbrook?" "I was managing my affairs adequately," I replied. "I'd been doing so for 12 years since my husband's death. But you had fallen and injured yourself, hadn't you? And you weren't driving as much as you used to?" "I had one fall on my stairs, which I reported to my son because I knew he'd worry if he found out about it from someone else. And yes, I was more cautious about driving at night, which I considered prudent rather than problematic. Mrs. Wood, my client was concerned about your safety and welfare. Isn't it possible that he was trying to help you plan for your future rather than trying to take advantage of you? This was the moment I'd been preparing for, and I looked directly at the jury as I answered. If my son had been genuinely concerned about my welfare, he would have discussed his concerns with me honestly and respected my right to make decisions about my own life. Instead, he deliberately misrepresented legal documents, moved my money without my knowledge, and sold my house without my consent. Those are not the actions of someone who respects the person they claim to be helping. The defense attorney tried several more approaches, but I felt confident that I'd made my points. Clearly, when I stepped down from the witness stand, I caught David looking at me with an expression that might have been regret, but it was too late for regret to matter. The trial continued for another week, with testimony from David's other victims, and expert witnesses explaining the patterns of elder abuse and financial exploitation. The prosecutor presented a compelling case that David had systematically targeted elderly clients of his insurance business, using his professional credentials and practiced charm to gain their trust before manipulating them into giving him control over their assets. One of the other victims was a man named Harold Peterson, whose story was remarkably similar to mine. David had convinced Harold that he needed to move to assisted living for his own safety, then used a power of attorney to sell Harold's house and transfer his investments to accounts that David controlled. Harold had lost over $200,000 before his nephew, a lawyer, had discovered what was happening and contacted the authorities. Another victim was a widow named Constance Martinez, who'd been persuaded to buy an expensive annuity that provided David with a substantial commission while leaving her with restricted access to her own money. When Constance had tried to withdraw funds for a medical emergency, she'd discovered that David had structured the annuity in a way that made early withdrawal nearly impossible. The pattern was clear and damning. David hadn't just betrayed me. He'd built an entire criminal enterprise around exploiting elderly people's trust and vulnerability. Each victim who testified was someone's parent or grandparent, someone who'd worked hard their entire lives to build financial security for their retirement years. The defense tried to portray David as a well-meaning professional who'd made some poor judgment calls but never intended to harm anyone. They brought in character witnesses who testified about his involvement in community organizations and his reputation as a caring family man. I found these testimonials almost harder to listen to than the accounts of his crimes. The David they described, the charitable volunteer, the devoted husband, the concerned son, was the David I'd thought I knew for most of my life. Understanding that both versions of my son could exist in the same person was perhaps the most difficult part of this entire experience. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning with their verdict. I was in the courtroom when the foreman stood to read the results. Guilty on all counts. David's face crumpled when he heard the verdict, and for a moment, he looked like the little boy I remembered from so many years ago. But then I reminded myself that the little boy had grown into a man who'd stolen from his elderly mother and multiple other vulnerable people, and my sympathy faded. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, which would give me time to prepare my victim impact statement for oral delivery. I spent weeks working on it, trying to capture not just the financial damage David had done, but the emotional and psychological impact of his betrayal. When the day arrived, I stood at the podium in front of the judge and spoke directly to my son for the first time in over a year. "David," I began, "when you were little, you used to tell me that I was the bravest person you knew. You said that because I was willing to kill spiders for you and check your closet for monsters at bedtime. I thought you understood that bravery meant protecting the people you love, not taking advantage of them when they're vulnerable." I went on to describe how his actions had affected not just my finances, but my ability to trust my own judgment and my faith in family relationships. I talked about the other victims whose lives he'd damaged and the broader impact of elder abuse, on families and communities. I don't know if you're capable of understanding the full scope of what you've done, I concluded, but I hope that someday you'll develop the capacity for genuine remorse rather than just self-pity. David was sentenced to 12 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 8 years. He was also ordered to pay restitution to his victims, though the judge acknowledged that recovering the full amount of stolen funds would likely be impossible. As I left the courthouse that day, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Justice had been served, but it didn't erase the pain of losing my son or undo the damage to my trust and sense of security. What it did do was validate my decision to fight back and protect other potential victims from experiencing what I'd gone through. The local newspaper covered the sentencing, and in the weeks that followed, I received dozens of letters from people who'd read about the case. Some were from other elderly people who'd experienced similar manipulation from family members. Others were from adult children who were struggling with how to help aging parents without overriding their autonomy and dignity. One letter particularly touched me. It was from a woman named Patricia whose mother was in the early stages of dementia. Reading about your experience helped me understand the difference between helping my mother and controlling her, Patricia wrote. I've been so focused on keeping her safe that I wasn't respecting her right to make decisions about her own life. Your story reminded me that dignity and autonomy are just as important as safety. Letters like that one reinforced my belief that sharing my story publicly had been the right choice, despite the personal cost. If my experience could help other families navigate the challenges of aging without resorting to manipulation and deception, then some good would come from the pain David had caused. As autumn turned to winter, I settled into a routine at Meadowbrook that felt genuinely peaceful for the first time since I'd moved there. I continued my art classes and my speaking engagements, and I started working on a memoir about my experience that I hoped might help other elder abuse victims find the courage to fight back. Eleanor and I had become close friends, bonding over our shared experiences with difficult adult children and our determination to create meaningful lives despite the challenges we'd faced. We started a support group for Meadowbrook residents who'd been victims of family financial abuse, and we were surprised by how many people wanted to participate. You know what I've learned from all of this? Eleanor said one afternoon as we sat in the garden working on our respective art projects. I've learned that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about people who treat you with love and respect, and who support your right to live your life on your own terms. I looked around at the community I'd built at Meadowbrook, the friends who celebrated my artistic achievements, the residents who came to my talks about financial safety, the staff members who'd supported me through the legal process, and I realized that Eleanor was absolutely right. This was my family now. And it was a family built on mutual respect rather than obligation or manipulation. David had tried to steal my money, my home, and my autonomy. But in fighting back against his betrayal, I'd discovered reserves of strength and resilience that I didn't know I possessed. I'd found my voice as an advocate for other vulnerable elderly people. I'd discovered artistic talents that brought me joy and recognition. I'd built relationships based on genuine affection and respect rather than guilt and manipulation. In trying to control my life for his own benefit, David had inadvertently set me free to become the person I was meant to be. That wasn't forgiveness. Exactly. But it was something like gratitude for the unexpected gifts that had emerged from such a painful experience. The winter months at Meadowbrook passed quietly, and I found myself settling into a rhythm of contentment that I hadn't experienced since before Robert's death. My art had evolved beyond simple watercolors to more complex mixed-media pieces that incorporated photography and collage elements. Maria Santos had encouraged me to experiment with different techniques, and I discovered that I had a particular talent for creating portraits that captured not just physical likeness, but emotional depth. My memoir writing had become a daily practice, and I was working with a local writing group that met at the community center every Thursday morning. The process of putting my experiences into narrative form was helping me understand patterns, in my relationship with David that I'd been blind to for years. Looking back through the lens of what I now knew about manipulation and financial abuse, I could see how he'd been conditioning me for exploitation long before the actual theft occurred. There had been small boundary violations that I'd dismissed as caring concern. Times when he'd made decisions about my medical care without consulting me first, claiming he was just trying to help. Occasions when he'd questioned my financial choices in ways that undermined my confidence in my own judgment. Moments when he'd made me feel guilty for having needs or preferences that inconvenienced him. Writing about these incidents was painful, but illuminating. I was beginning to understand that David's betrayal hadn't been a sudden descent into criminality, but rather the culmination of a gradual erosion of respect for my autonomy that had been happening for years. Dr. Hendricks was helping me process these realizations during our continued therapy sessions. We'd moved beyond crisis intervention to what she called post-traumatic growth, the process of finding meaning and strength in the aftermath of trauma. "You're not just surviving what happened to you," she observed during one of our sessions. "You're transforming it into something that serves others. That's a remarkable achievement." She was referring to my increasing involvement in elder advocacy work. What had started as occasional speaking engagements had evolved into a more formal role as a volunteer educator with the Area Agency on Aging. I was now conducting monthly workshops on financial safety for seniors, and I'd been invited to participate in training programs for bank employees and social workers who worked with elderly clients. The work was fulfilling in ways I hadn't expected. Each workshop brought me into contact with people who were facing similar challenges to the ones I'd experienced, and I found that my story gave them permission to trust their own instincts when family members or caregivers were pressuring them to make financial decisions they weren't comfortable with. During one particularly memorable workshop at a senior center across town, an elderly woman named Rose approached me afterward with tears in her eyes. "My grandson has been pressuring me to add his name to my bank accounts," she said. "He says, it's just to make things easier if something happens to me. But after hearing your presentation, I realized that making things easier might not be in my best interests." Rose's situation was exactly the kind of scenario that David had used to manipulate me and his other victims. Adult children or grandchildren would frame their requests for financial control in terms of convenience and safety, when their real motivation was gaining access to assets they felt entitled to inherit. "Trust your instincts," I told Rose. "If something feels wrong about his request, there's probably a good reason for that feeling. You can always consult with a lawyer or financial advisor who doesn't have a personal stake in your decisions." Conversations like that one reinforced my growing understanding that elder abuse wasn't just about individual bad actors like David. It was about societal attitudes that devalued elderly people's autonomy and intelligence, that treated aging as inevitably leading to incompetence, and that prioritized family convenience over individual dignity. These insights were influencing the advocacy work I was doing beyond just financial education. I'd joined the board of directors for a nonprofit organization called Elder Rights Alliance, which worked on policy issues affecting older adults. We were pushing for stronger laws around financial exploitation, better training for professionals who worked with elderly clients, and public awareness campaigns about the warning signs of elder abuse. The work was demanding, but energizing. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was using my intelligence and experience for something larger than my own immediate concerns. The skills I'd developed as a business owner's wife, as a volunteer, and as someone who'd survived financial exploitation were all proving valuable in this new role. It was during a board meeting in early spring that I learned about a development that would bring my past back into sharp focus. Our executive director, Janet Martinez, was updating us on recent legal cases when she mentioned something that made my heart skip a beat. "We've been following the appeal of a case involving David Wood, the insurance agent who was convicted of elder financial abuse last year. His lawyers are arguing that the sentences were excessive and that his crimes don't warrant the lengthy prison term he received." I felt my face flush with anger. David was trying to get his sentence reduced, claiming that 12 years in prison was too harsh for what his lawyers were undoubtedly characterizing as well-intentioned mistakes rather than deliberate crimes. What are the chances that his appeal will be successful? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Janet looked surprised by my intense interest in the case, and I realized I hadn't mentioned my personal connection to David's crimes during previous board meetings. "That's actually my son you're talking about," I said quietly. The room fell silent, and I could see the board members processing this revelation. Several of them knew about my background as an elder abuse survivor, but I'd never mentioned David by name or discussed the specifics of my case. "Jennifer," Janet said gently, "I had no idea. Are you all right with us discussing this case?" "I'm more than all right with it. I want to know everything about his appeal and what we can do to ensure that it's unsuccessful." Over the next hour, Janet filled me in on the details of David's legal strategy. His lawyers were arguing that he'd been overcharged, that his actions were motivated by genuine concern for his elderly clients rather than criminal intent, and that the sentences handed down were disproportionate compared to other financial crimes. They were also claiming that the prosecution had relied too heavily on emotional testimony from victims rather than objective evidence of criminal behavior. In other words, they were arguing that people like me were unreliable witnesses who'd allowed our hurt feelings to exaggerate the significance of David's actions. "What can I do to help fight this appeal?" I asked. Janet explained that victim impact statements could be submitted as part of the appellate process, and that additional evidence of David's criminal pattern could strengthen the prosecution's case if such evidence existed. "Actually," she said thoughtfully, "your unique position as both a victim and an advocate might give you opportunities to gather information that law enforcement couldn't access. Other victims might be willing to share details with you that they wouldn't feel comfortable telling prosecutors or police officers." This conversation sparked an idea that would consume my attention for the next several months. If David's lawyers were trying to minimize his crimes by claiming they were isolated incidents motivated by misguided concern, I would document every aspect of his criminal enterprise to prove that his actions were part of a calculated pattern of exploitation. I began reaching out to other victims whose names had come up during the original investigation. Some were reluctant to revisit painful experiences, but others were eager to share their stories with someone who understood what they'd been through. Harold Peterson, the man who'd lost over $200,000 to David's schemes, became a particularly valuable ally in this effort. Harold had been keeping detailed records of his interactions with David, and he'd discovered additional evidence of fraud that hadn't been presented during the original trial. David convinced me to invest in a certificate of deposit that supposedly offered guaranteed returns well above market rates, Harold explained during one of our meetings at his apartment in a different assisted living facility. It wasn't until after my nephew got involved that I learned the CD didn't actually exist. David had been depositing my money into his personal accounts and sending me fake statements showing fictitious interest payments. This was evidence of sophisticated fraud that went well beyond the financial exploitation charges David had been convicted of. Harold had been afraid to come forward with this information during the original trial because David's lawyer had made him feel stupid for falling for such an obvious scam. "I felt like such a fool," Harold said. "Here I was, a retired accountant who'd managed finances my whole career, and I let myself get taken in by fake investment documents that I should have been able to spot immediately." "You weren't a fool," I told him firmly. "You were a target. David spent years perfecting his techniques for exploiting people's trust and vulnerability. The fact that you were intelligent and experienced made you a more valuable target, not a less likely one." Harold's story was particularly important because it demonstrated the premeditated nature of David's crimes. Creating fake investment. Documents required planning, technical knowledge, and a complete disregard for his victim's welfare. This wasn't someone making impulsive decisions motivated by misguided concern. This was someone operating a carefully planned criminal enterprise. I worked with Harold to organize his documentation and prepare a comprehensive report that we could submit to the prosecutor handling David's appeal. We also reached out to other victims to see if any of them had similar experiences with fake investments or forged documents. Constance Martinez, the widow who'd been sold the restrictive annuity, revealed that David had also convinced her to cash out a legitimate retirement account and reinvest the funds in what he claimed was a special government bond program that offered tax advantages for seniors. He showed me official-looking documents with government seals and everything, Constance explained. He said it was a limited-time opportunity that was only available to clients he trusted. I felt honored that he'd chosen me for such an exclusive investment. The government bond program had been as fictitious as Harold's certificate of deposit. Constance's money had disappeared into David's personal accounts, and she'd only discovered the fraud when she'd tried to access the funds during a medical emergency. These revelations were devastating, but also energizing. Each new piece of evidence made it clear that David's crimes were far more extensive and sophisticated than had been revealed during his original trial. His appeal lawyers were arguing that he was essentially a good man who'd made some poor judgment calls, but the evidence we were uncovering painted a picture of a calculating predator who'd built an entire criminal career around exploiting elderly people's trust. I compiled all of this information into a comprehensive report that I submitted to the prosecutor's office, along with victim impact statements from Harold, Constance, and 3 other victims who'd come forward with additional evidence of David's fraudulent schemes. The prosecutor, Maria Rodriguez, called me personally to thank me for the work I'd done in gathering this evidence. "Jennifer, what you've uncovered here is going to be crucial in fighting David's appeal," she said. "His lawyers have been arguing that he was a basically honest person who made some mistakes. But this evidence shows a pattern of sophisticated fraud that completely undermines that narrative." The appeal process moved slowly through the court system, but I felt confident that we'd built a strong case for upholding David's original sentence. More importantly, the investigation had connected me with a network of other elder abuse survivors who were working together to prevent similar crimes from happening to other families. We formed an informal support group that met monthly at the community center, sharing resources and strategies for healing from the trauma of family financial abuse. Several members of the group had become advocates themselves, speaking at community events and working with law enforcement to improve their response to elder abuse cases. Eleanor joined our group even though she hadn't been a victim of financial abuse herself. Her adult children had tried to pressure her into moving to a nursing home against her will, and she understood the psychological dynamics of family members who believed they knew what was best for their elderly parents better than the parents themselves knew. The common thread in all of our stories, Eleanor observed during one of our meetings, is adult children who stopped seeing us as autonomous, individuals worthy of respect, and started seeing us as problems to be managed or resources to be controlled. She was exactly right. Whether the abuse was financial, emotional, or involved forced living arrangements, the underlying issue was the same. Adult children who felt entitled to override their parents' preferences and decisions based on their own assessments of what was practical or convenient. This insight was influencing the advocacy work I was doing on a larger scale. I'd been invited to speak at a national conference on elder abuse, and I was planning to focus my presentation on the importance of maintaining elderly people's autonomy and dignity, even when they needed assistance with certain aspects of their lives. The conference was scheduled for late summer, and preparing for it had become a major focus of my spring and early summer activities. I was working on a presentation that would combine my personal story with the broader research on elder abuse prevention, and I was collaborating with other advocates from around the country to develop policy recommendations for better protecting elderly people's rights. The work was intellectually stimulating and emotionally rewarding in ways that reminded me why I'd enjoyed the volunteer work I'd done during my marriage to Robert. I was using my skills and experience to make a meaningful contribution to an important cause, and I was building relationships with people who shared my values and goals. My life at Meadowbrook had become the foundation for this broader work, rather than the limitation I'd initially feared it would be. The stability and support I found there allowed me to take on challenges and commitments that would have been difficult to manage if I'd been struggling with the practical aspects of daily living. Margaret Peterson had become not just an administrator, but a genuine friend and supporter of my advocacy work. She'd arranged for me to use Meadowbrook's conference room for our survivor support group meetings, and she'd encouraged other residents to attend my financial safety workshops. "You've transformed what could have been a devastating experience into something that's helping countless other people," she told me one afternoon as we discussed my upcoming conference presentation. "That takes remarkable strength and resilience." I was beginning to understand that my experience with David, painful as it had prepared me for work that I might never have discovered otherwise. The insights I'd gained about manipulation and abuse, the legal knowledge I'd acquired through fighting back, and the emotional growth I'd achieved through therapy and advocacy work had all combined to give me a unique perspective on elder abuse prevention. The conference presentation went better than I'd hoped. The audience of social workers, law enforcement officers, attorneys, and policymakers was engaged and responsive, asking thoughtful questions and expressing genuine interest in the policy. Recommendations our advocacy group had developed. Several attendees approached me afterward to discuss collaboration on future projects. One was a researcher from a major university who was studying the long-term psychological effects of family financial abuse on elderly victims. Another was a state legislator who was working on bills to strengthen elder abuse protections and was looking for survivors who could provide testimony about the need for such legislation. These conversations opened up new possibilities for my advocacy work that I hadn't previously considered. I was being invited to participate in research, studies, policy development processes, and educational initiatives that could have impact on a national scale. The most meaningful conversation, though, was with a woman named Patricia, whose elderly mother had recently been victimized by a financial scam perpetrated by her grandson. Patricia had read about my work and had driven 3 hours to attend the conference specifically to meet me. "I've been struggling with how to help my mother heal from what happened to her," Patricia said. "She's been so devastated by the betrayal that she's withdrawn from everyone and won't talk about what happened. I'm hoping you might have some insights about how to support her." Patricia's mother's situation was heartbreakingly familiar. The combination of financial loss and family betrayal created a type of trauma that was particularly difficult to recover from because it damaged not just material security, but fundamental trust in family relationships. I shared some of the strategies that had helped me heal. Therapy with someone who understood elder abuse, connecting with other survivors, finding ways to transform the experience into something that helped others, and allowing myself to grieve the relationship I'd thought I had, rather than trying to salvage something that had never been genuine. "The most important thing," I told Patricia, "is to validate your mother's right to feel angry and betrayed. Too many people try to rush elderly abuse victims toward forgiveness or acceptance before they've had time to process what was done to them." Patricia took careful notes during our conversation, and she promised to stay in touch about her mother's progress. Before she left, she said something that stayed with me for weeks afterward. "You know, I think my mother would benefit from hearing your story not just because you survived financial abuse, but because you've shown that it's possible to build a meaningful life afterward. She's been feeling like her life is over, but you're proof that it's possible to find purpose and joy even after such a devastating betrayal." That evening, as I sat in my Meadowbrook apartment reflecting on the day's events, I realized that Patricia was right about something important. My life hadn't just continued after David's betrayal, it had become richer and more purposeful than it had been before. The person I'd been when I was trying to maintain a relationship with a son who didn't respect or value me had been constrained by the need to avoid conflict and maintain family harmony at any cost. The person I was now felt free to speak truthfully about my experiences, to advocate for causes I believed in, and to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. David had tried to steal my autonomy and reduce me to a source of financial benefit for himself. Instead, his crimes had inadvertently freed me to discover strengths and purposes I'd never had the opportunity to explore before. I thought about the upcoming appeal hearing, which was scheduled for the following month. David's lawyers would undoubtedly argue that he'd learned from his mistakes and deserved a chance at redemption. They might even suggest that the stress of the legal proceedings had been punishment enough for someone who was fundamentally a good person who'd made some poor choices. But I knew something his lawyers didn't understand. David's actions hadn't just harmed his individual victims. They'd contributed to a culture that devalued elderly people's autonomy and dignity. They'd reinforced harmful stereotypes about aging and competence. They'd damaged families and communities in ways that would take years to fully heal. The work I was doing now, the advocacy, the education, the policy development, was partly motivated by my desire to ensure that other families didn't experience what David had put me through. But it was also motivated by my determination to change the social conditions that had made his crimes possible in the first place. I was no longer just Jennifer Wood, the elderly woman whose son had stolen from her. I was Jennifer Wood, elder, rights advocate, financial abuse survivor, artist, writer, and educator. I was someone whose voice mattered in important conversations about how society treats its aging members. David had tried to silence that voice by reducing me to a dependent who couldn't be trusted to make decisions about her own life. Instead, his actions had given me both the motivation and the credibility to speak out about issues that affected millions of elderly people across the country. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt grateful for the unexpected directions my life had taken, not grateful for David's betrayal. That would always be a source of sadness and disappointment. But grateful for the strength I'd discovered in myself, for the meaningful work I'd found, and for the community of advocates and survivors who'd become my chosen family. Tomorrow, I would continue working on the brief opposing David's appeal. I would finish preparing for my testimony before the state legislature about proposed elder abuse prevention bills. I would attend Eleanor's book club and continue work on my memoir and start planning my next art exhibition. I would continue building the life I'd chosen for myself rather than the life others had chosen for me. And I would continue using my voice to help other elderly people understand that they deserved dignity, respect, and autonomy, regardless of their age or family circumstances. David's attempts to control my life had ultimately given me the tools and motivation to help others resist similar control. That wasn't forgiveness, but it was something like redemption. Not his, but mine. The appellate court's decision came. On a gray November morning, delivered to my phone by Maria Rodriguez while I was leading a financial safety workshop at the downtown senior center. I stepped outside to take the call, my heart pounding as I waited to hear whether David's sentence would be upheld or reduced. "Jennifer," Maria's voice was triumphant, "the court rejected David's appeal completely. Not only are they upholding his original sentence, but they specifically cited the additional evidence you helped gather as proof that his crimes were more extensive and calculating than his defense team claimed." I leaned against the brick wall of the senior center, feeling a mixture of relief and vindication wash over me. The months of investigation, the painful process of documenting every detail of David's deception, and the emotional energy I'd invested in fighting his appeal had been worth it. "There's more," Maria continued. "The appellate judges were so disturbed by the scope of David's fraud that they've referred the case to federal authorities for additional investigation. There may be charges related to mail fraud and interstate financial crimes that could extend his sentence even further." After hanging up, I stood outside for several more minutes, processing this final chapter in the legal battle against my son. David would serve his full 12-year sentence, and possibly longer if federal charges were filed. He would be nearly 60 years old when he was released, his insurance career permanently destroyed, his reputation ruined beyond repair. Part of me felt sad about this outcome. Not for David himself, but for the little boy he'd once been, and the man he could have chosen to become. But a larger part of me felt satisfied that justice had been served not just for me, but for Harold, Constance, and all the other elderly people whose trust and savings David had exploited. I returned to the workshop energized by the news, and when I shared the outcome with the participants, the room erupted in applause. These were people who understood what it meant to fight back against financial exploitation, and they celebrated my victory as if it were their own. After the workshop ended, I drove back to Meadowbrook with a sense of completion that I hadn't expected to feel. The legal battle was finally over. David would face full consequences for his crimes, and I was free to focus entirely on building the life I'd chosen for myself. That evening, Eleanor and I sat in the Meadowbrook Library, which had become our favorite place for quiet conversations. I told her about the court's decision and about my mixed feelings regarding this final resolution. "You know what this means, don't you?" Eleanor said thoughtfully. "It means you've proven that elderly people don't have to be victims. You've shown that we can fight back against abuse and win, even when the abuser is our own family member." She was right. My victory wasn't just personal. It was symbolic of something larger. Every time an elderly person successfully fought back against financial exploitation, it challenged the assumption that aging inevitably led to helplessness and victimization. Over the following weeks, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected, ways my life had transformed since that terrible day when I discovered the sold sign on my house. I'd lost a son, but I'd gained a community of fellow advocates who shared my commitment to protecting elderly people's rights. I'd lost my childhood home, but I'd found my authentic voice as an educator and speaker. Most importantly, I'd learned that my worth as a person wasn't dependent on being a good mother to someone who didn't respect or value me. I was worthy of dignity and autonomy simply because I was a human being, not because of the relationships I maintained or the convenience I provided to others. My memoir was nearing completion, and I'd found a publisher who specialized in books about aging and family relationships. The advance wasn't substantial, but seeing my story in print felt like the ultimate validation of my decision to speak out about elder abuse. I'd also been invited to testify before Congress about federal elder abuse prevention legislation. The hearing was scheduled for the spring, and I was already working with other advocates to prepare testimony that would highlight the need for stronger protections and better enforcement of existing laws. The art exhibition featuring my latest watercolors was opening next month at a gallery downtown. 3 of the pieces had already sold, and I'd been commissioned to create a portrait series featuring other Meadowbrook residents. The income from my art sales wasn't enough to live on, but it provided a sense of financial independence that I treasured after having my autonomy stripped away by David's manipulation. On a crisp December evening, as I was putting the finishing touches on my congressional testimony, I received a letter that surprised me. It was from Sharon, postmarked from Ohio, where she'd moved after divorcing David. "Dear Jennifer," the letter began, "I've been following the news about David's failed appeal, and I wanted you to know how proud I am of your courage in fighting back against what he did to you and others. I also wanted to thank you for the letter you wrote to the court on my behalf during our divorce proceedings. It helped me get a fair settlement that will allow me to rebuild my life." Sharon went on to describe her new job as a bookkeeper for a small nonprofit organization and her growing involvement in volunteer work with domestic violence survivors. She'd started therapy to help her understand how she'd enabled David's controlling behavior, and she was working to build relationships based on equality and mutual respect rather than manipulation and dependence. "I know I can never undo the damage that David did to you," her letter concluded, "but I hope you know that watching you fight back gave me the courage to stand up for myself too. You've inspired more people than you probably realize." Reading Sharon's letter, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. While I wasn't ready to resume a relationship with her, I was glad to know that she was building a healthier life for herself and learning from the painful lessons of her marriage to David. The holiday season at Meadowbrook was more festive than I'd anticipated. I'd organized a gift drive for the legal aid organization that helped elderly abuse victims, and residents throughout the facility had contributed money, warm clothing, and personal care items for people who were fighting to recover assets stolen by family members. On Christmas Eve, our survivor support group gathered for a special celebration in the Meadowbrook dining room. Harold had driven over from his facility. Constance had brought homemade cookies, and several newer members shared updates on their own legal battles against exploitative family members. "A year ago, I felt like my life was over," said Margaret, a woman whose daughter had stolen her Social Security checks for months before being caught. "Tonight, I feel like I'm part of something important, something that matters." That sentiment captured exactly how I felt about the journey I'd taken from victim to advocate. David's crimes had nearly destroyed my sense of self-worth and my faith in family relationships. But the process of fighting back had revealed strengths I didn't know I possessed and connected me with a community of people who valued courage, integrity, and mutual support. As the evening wound down and residents began returning to their apartments, Eleanor and I lingered in the dining room, reflecting on the year that was ending and the possibilities that lay ahead. "Do you ever regret fighting back?" she asked. "Do you ever wish you'd just accepted what David did and tried to maintain some kind of relationship with him?" I considered her question carefully. There had certainly been moments during the legal proceedings when I'd wondered whether the emotional cost of confronting David was worth the potential benefits. Fighting him had meant accepting that our relationship was permanently damaged, that I would likely never see him again, and that I would spend my remaining years without the family connection I'd treasured for most of my life. "No," I said finally. "I don't regret it at all. The relationship I thought I had with David was based on his ability to manipulate me and my willingness to be manipulated. Once I understood that, there was nothing real left to save." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "I think that's the hardest lesson of aging. Learning to distinguish between authentic relationships and ones that only exist because we're willing to accept poor treatment in exchange for the illusion of family connection." As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on Eleanor's words and on the year that was ending. I'd lost a son, but I'd gained a sense of purpose that gave meaning to every day. I'd lost my childhood home, but I'd found a community where I was valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. Most importantly, I'd proven to myself that it was never too late to stand up for dignity and autonomy, never too late to refuse to be victimized, and never too late to build a life based on authentic relationships and meaningful work. David was spending Christmas in prison, facing the consequences of his choice to exploit the people who trusted him most. I was spending Christmas surrounded by friends who respected and valued me, celebrating the completion of legal battles that had validated my decision to fight back against his abuse. The contrast between our circumstances wasn't lost on me. David had tried to steal my future security to guarantee his own inheritance. Instead, his crimes had led directly to his imprisonment and my liberation. He'd attempted to control my life, for his benefit, but his manipulation had ultimately freed me to discover who I really was when I wasn't constrained by the need to maintain a relationship with someone who didn't respect me. As I turned off the lights in my apartment, I felt grateful for the unexpected directions my life had taken. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to advocate for elder rights, new chances to help other families avoid the trauma I'd experienced, and new possibilities for creative expression through my art and writing. I was no longer Jennifer Wood, the elderly woman whose son had abandoned her at an assisted living facility. I was Jennifer Wood, survivor, advocate, artist, and educator. I was someone whose voice mattered in important conversations about dignity, autonomy, and the rights of aging people. David had tried to reduce me to a source of financial benefit, and then discard me when I was no longer useful to him. Instead, his crimes had revealed my strength, clarified my values, and connected me with work that gave meaning to every day of my remaining years. That wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't gratitude for what he'd done to me. But it was acknowledgement that his worst actions had inadvertently led to some of the best discoveries of my life. In trying to destroy my autonomy, David had forced me to claim it more completely than I ever had before. The future stretched ahead of me, full of possibilities I was finally free to explore. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.